So this is my refillable water bottle. And I encourage all of you to get the free app on your cell phone for the WeTap app so you can find hydration stations all around the world and refill your bottles. Okay, so perhaps you have heard the Native American saying that when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish caught, the last river poisoned, only then will we realize that one cannot eat money. This principle about how greed and taking natural resources will leave us bankrupt of life is perfectly illustrated. Let's see if I can work this. Yes. Is perfectly illustrated in the book, The Lorax. And I don't know if any of you have read it recently, or if you read it as a child, or have read it to your children recently, or seen the movie. But this is literally my favorite book. If you remember the story, it starts with the Onceler, who is this creature who is hiding in this thing called a lurkum, because he's so full of shame and regret that he did not follow sustainable business practices. Basically, what this Onceler did, and his name indicates his business practices, Onceler, one way through with no circular plan. What he did was he discovered these great trees, the truffula trees, and he wanted to make thneeds, this thing that he thought everyone needs from the trees, the truffula trees. But he didn't think about sustaining his business. And all along his business practices, he's like, I need to bigger and bigger and bigger my business. The Lorax, who basically represents environmentalists, was warning him the entire time. You're ruining the water, you're ruining the air, you're ruining the land. And the Onceler would not listen. So his business practice ended. His business ended when he chopped down the last truffula tree. So then he had to retreat to his lurkum, where he sells his story to passersby about his horrible ruination of the environment. So if you're wondering why Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, came up with this brilliant parable of capitalism without regulation, it was really the times that he was living in. And the book was published first in 1971. Oops, I'm going backwards. And he was responding to a great surge of environmentalism in the 1970s. And the first little, I'll give you some historical points of our environmental awareness. And the first one I'd like to point to is Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which really kickstarted the environmental movement. And that book spoke about the thinning of eggshells from DDT. And it was a wake-up call that we were going to have a silent spring with no birds if we continued using this poison. And DDT was banned from agricultural purposes, and awareness began of our relationship of business to the environment. But not all the voices of the Loraxes, like Rachel Carson, were heard. There were other voices that went unheeded. And I'd like to point to this great voice. President Johnson actually was an early recognizer of climate change. And way back on February 8th, 1965, in a special message to Congress on conservation and restoration of natural beauty, the president warned of the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he said, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Pollution destroys beauty and menaces health. It cuts down on the efficiency, reduces property values, and raises taxes. The longer we wait to act, the greater the dangers and the larger the problem. So that was in 1965. So then, I'm going to keep on doing that. Return of the Lorax. Okay, so then, on March 18th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy spoke at the University of Kansas. And he was another voice of the Lorax. He said, too much and too long, we seem to have surrendered community excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product, if we should judge America by that, counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for those who break them. It counts the destruction of redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm and the cost of a nuclear warhead, and armored cars for police who fight riots in the street. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs that glorify violence in order to sell toys to children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry and the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes our life worthwhile. And it tells us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. So, voice of the Lorax. Then in the 1960s, in 1969, June 22nd, the Cuyahoga River burst into flames, 5 stories high, from an oil and chemical pollution. The river fire became a defining moment in the new environmental movement. And then something that some of the older people in the audience may remember, I certainly remember, the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, was started by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. I happened to be in Wisconsin as a second grader then. And 20 million Americans came out and celebrated the Earth, the importance that we have only one planet and that we need to take care of her if we're going to survive. The Earth Day also led eventually to legislation, important legislation, such as amendments to the Clean Air Act and the creation of the 1972 Clean Water Act. Okay, all these things that I've just spoken about preceded Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, writing the Lorax. But did business change, or did it just go on as usual, like the Onceler? Well, we certainly made progress in some areas through effective legislation of smokestacks and tailpipe emissions, but we failed to keep up with pollution and carbon dioxide rising and in water pollution, and business unfortunately contributed greatly to the destruction of our resources by failing to design for long-term sustainability, outsourcing the cost of pollution onto the public, and using advertising to convince the public that it is our duty to clean up the world and not the duty of business to control pollution. So right after the first Earth Day, we get the first powerful message in advertising to respond to it, which was created by Keep America Beautiful. And many of you might remember the Crying Native American ad. Well, it's actually a very effective piece of propaganda, because Keep America Beautiful was formed by packaging companies that were actually fighting environmental regulation at the time. They did not disclose this, of course, in their advertising. And Keep America Beautiful, which was formed by these packaging corporations and Coca-Cola, they had had a very cute little ad before this featuring Susie Spotless, who was all dressed in white, and she would wag her finger at her parents when they littered, no, 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 no. But in the 70s, that was no longer cool. So the advertisers decided that they were going to turn to Native American culture, which was very popular with the counterculture as being more authentic than the commercialized corporations, right? So they took this actor, who was not really a Native American, he was Italian, and he played Native Americans in life and on film, and they made this ad campaign, which seemed to be genuine and counterculture, but was actually trying to flip the conversation to putting the responsibility for pollution on customers, on the public, instead of on the corporations like themselves. So the key point of this ad, if you remember, is when he starts crying and this baritone voice narration comes over and says, "People start pollution, people can stop it." So it's kind of like the gun industry. Guns don't kill people, people do. So it was trying to put the responsibility away from the manufacturers and onto the public. And so after this ad, we had a wave of cleanup campaigns. And cleanup campaigns are fine, they're wonderful. In fact, when I was at Keel the Bay, I was very involved with International Coastal Cleanup Day, which is a very important function because not only are you picking up plastic off the beaches, but we're cataloging the top 10 items found on the beach, which is important scientific information from which we can legislate and we can create better products. So there's a lot of importance in coastal cleanup, and like Kids Ocean Day, it can inform children about how pollution impacts our environment. But the problem was that what business was doing with campaigns like this was taking away their own responsibility and taking away and putting the burden of pollution control onto the public, which was not a sustainable model. In fact, all these businesses behind it were proceeding with the Onceler model of business, of making single-use products and packaging to go out and to end up in landfills and polluting our environment. So after that whole thing, we get to the argument of the environment versus business, like it's an either or. And we all in this room know that that's not true. But it was a myth perpetuated, especially in politics, to avoid regulation. And one of my favorite books besides the Lorax, and I have a signed copy here from after Wisconsin. I grew up in Tennessee, and Al Gore was my senator. And so I have this lovely signed copy of Earth in the Balance, a fantastic book, which still is very, very relevant. Al Gore decided to write a book about how that Earth versus the environment is a totally false dichotomy. It's not either or. In fact, as we know from the Lorax, if you follow unsustainable business practices, there will be no Earth to put in the balance and there will be no business. So what Al Gore did was, the center of the book is this diagram. And I'd like you to take a look at it. This is an illustration from the first President Bush. And he passed this out to a 1990 White House conference on the global environment. And listen to Al Gore's discussion of this image from his book. In many ways, the Bush administration's entire cost-benefit analysis is misguided and reflects an apparent inability to see the magnitude of the environmental crisis. Thus far, the administration has been blind to the true value of preserving the environment while keenly aware of the price. When President Bush welcomed an international conference on the global environment in the spring of 1990, his staff prepared materials for visiting negotiators that contained a graphic illustration of the administration's approach to balancing the short-term monetary gains against the long-term environmental destruction. In the illustration, several bars of gold rested on one tray on the scale. On the other tray perched the entire Earth and all its natural systems, seemingly with a weight and value roughly equivalent to the 6 bars of gold. A scientist, or perhaps an economist, is noting the careful balance on her clipboard, although several delegates from other countries commented privately that it seemed to be an ironic symbol of Bush's approach to the crisis. The president and his staff seemed wholly oblivious to the absurdity of their willingness to place the entire Earth in the balance. Earth in the Balance being the title of Al Gore's phenomenal book. So one can only imagine if Trump were to have an environmental summit, which I highly doubt he will, what size the Earth would be if it were represented at all. So, Earth in the Balance. So and still on Earth in the Balance, Al Gore in his book, which is just excellent, showed that some of America's best corporations were doing a better job than the government in responding to the crisis. He said, those that have made a strong commitment to environmental responsibility have found, to their surprise, that when they start to see their pollution and look for ways to minimize it, they begin to see new ways to cut down on their use of expensive raw materials and new ways to improve efficiency in virtually every part of the production process. For example, he cites 3M Company, credits its pollution prevention pays program with major improvements in profits. And Xerox and several other companies have reported the same experience. So Al Gore's book shows business examples of how environmental consciousness and good business profits can go hand in hand, and it's not an either or. So more recently, I'm sure you're all aware of the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. And this balance of the public versus business gets really lopsided when businesses are considered to be people for the purposes of political speech. And I have written extensively about this. I really like this little graphic here, slavery, the legal fiction that people are property, and corporate personhood, the legal fiction that property is people. But this decision really impacts democracy by amplifying the voices of corporations whose sole goal is profit and not balancing those interests with environmental protection. So we can see actually that voices like the Koch brothers have been amplified, and this may actually have impacted our election. So we come to Trump. who is unregulate America again. And Trump's team comes in, he appoints someone antithetical to environmental production, Scott Pruitt, to head the EPA. And he says, we're going to get rid of 2 regulations for every one that we pass, and we are going to get rid of public lands, we're going to drill in the oceans, and we're going to allow coal ash to be dumped in our rivers and streams again. How any of those things benefit business in America is very questionable, but we know, of course, the costs. So Trump's business model that he's pushing on America is entirely the Onceler business approach, and there are no Loraxes in his administration. And even the head of the EPA is not a Lorax. So it's pretty shocking. But what's crazy is that if you noticed in the news a few days ago, there was a report on Trump's own Office of Management and Budget just put out a report on the period between 2006 and 2016, Obama's years, and counting the costs of regulation versus the benefits of regulation. Now, they slipped this report out on a Friday night with no fanfare, and so it didn't get that much business, that much press. But the report of Trump's own Office of Management and Budget released says it shows that federal regulations in place between 2006 and 2016 brought between $287 billion and $911 billion in benefits, dramatically outweighing the costs of regulation between $78 and $115 billion. In sum, federal regulations offered a net benefit of up to $833 billion. So the same Friday that this OMB report came out, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt spoke at the Conservative Political Action Conference, touting the repeal of 22 environmental and public health benefits regulations that he claimed would save the nation $1 billion. He did not mention the economic benefits of the rules or the societal benefits listed in the OMB report, such as fewer deaths, asthma attacks, cardiovascular conditions, and lower rates of cancer. So again, we have a Onceler mindset in office again. So are we doomed? I don't want you to feel too depressed. In the absence of effective government, right now we have business coming to the rescue. It's a shock, I know, but it's true. And CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, is the largest asset manager in the world. BlackRock manages $6.3 trillion in assets. And in a letter to CEOs of public companies, Fink recently said that companies need to demonstrate a strategy for long-term value creation and financial performance, and that understanding a company's effect on the world is a key component. Simply managing for short-term shareholder profit is not an acceptable management strategy, Fink says. So this is a quote from his letter to CEOs, warning them that they need to get with the program. Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a societal purpose, Fink wrote. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Okay, So, tying this up, why should businesses agree to self-regulate and to push for creation of legislation to protect the environment? I have 5 reasons, at least. Okay, the first reason is because Larry Fink says so. That's a good enough reason. The second is to level the playing field for best management practices so that sustainable business practices are not undercut in the short term by polluters who outsource the cost of their pollution onto society. And I'm going to give you some real examples here. As an environmental attorney, I work primarily in creating legal policy, laws, regulations, the kind that Donald Trump hates. And one of these laws that I worked on was to control nurdles. Now, nurdles, you may know, are the building blocks of all plastic products. They're the plastic pellets. They look kind of like polenta that are melted and molded into every kind of plastic product that we use. Well, Charlie Moore of Algalita did some research and found that these were on the beaches everywhere. They're part of our sand. And he went backwards and looked at the businesses that are manufacturing these. And he found that some businesses were controlling their nurdle production so that they weren't getting out into the environment, while others were not. And they weren't covering the nurdles in transportation. They weren't being careful at the factories, and they were getting out into the environment. So basically, the law that we got passed to control nurdles took best management practices from the businesses that were handling them correctly and made that the law. And this is really fair to businesses that are doing things the right way to control their pollution. And so I encourage you, all of you in businesses, to think about what you do that's a good management practice, and seek your legislators and try and get that into policy, because you're being undermined by companies that don't do it the right way, and you can raise the level of business responsibility by getting best management practices into law. Here's another example, microbeads. My friend Rachel Dowdy and I co-wrote the law for banning microbeads in consumer products, like in face scrubs and body washes and toothpaste. Companies were getting away from using natural materials, natural abrasives for exfoliants, and getting into using plastics because plastics are so cheap. We are fracking like crazy. We have so much virgin plastic. Nobody's recycling anymore because we have so much of this cheap virgin material. So companies were substituting the natural things with this cheap plastic, these balls, to exfoliate, which is really stupid because, number one, they don't exfoliate. They're perfectly smooth and spherical. They don't do a damn thing. But secondly, when you wash with them in the shower or the sink, the plastic goes right down the drain and into our sewage system, and it can't be filtered because it's so small and it gets out into the ocean. So basically, we are eating our plastic waste. So we banned plastic microbeads in California and many states, and then we got federal legislation passed, which Obama signed. So that was a really exciting piece of legislation. Another one, plastic straws. Oh, and back to best management practices, there were companies that were doing it the right way, that were using apricot shells and all the things we grew up with that actually work and are fine if they get out into the environment. So again, we were legislating to the standard of best management practices. Okay, so right now I've got a law that is going through the California legislature. And plastic straws, we've all been talking about, nobody needs them. And they are one of the top 10 items always found on the beaches on International Coastal Cleanup Day. So this is a plastic we can easily do away with. And in best scenarios, plastic straws should be banned. There are perfectly good alternatives. There are paper straws, and there are reusable straws, and in general, people don't need a straw. So in ideal circumstances, some communities are banning them. But to get a law passed in this political environment in California, unfortunately, I think the best we can do right now is to make straws available on request only. And I took this idea for this law from the practice of only offering water upon request at restaurants. You may have noticed that because of the drought. So now when you go to a restaurant, they're not supposed to put the water down. They're supposed to say, would you like water? And a lot of great restaurants now are just offering free filtered water instead of bottled water. The best restaurants are. So I took that law and said, let's just do that with straws, because I get personally offended when I order a margarita and say no straw. I want that salty rim. Why else would you have salt on the rim? And it comes with a stupid plastic straw. It just drives me crazy. And if you ask for it not to have a straw, it comes anyway, because it's such habitual practice, and it gets lost in the chain of command between your waiter and the bar. But if we make it the law, and there's an actual penalty on the restaurant if they violate the law, then they'll start to take notice. And you may actually get a reduction in plastic straw use. At least I believe you will. So that's another example. You can follow that through the legislature. Another reason for your business to support environmental regulation is for innovation and cost savings. Refining manufacturing to cut pollution and create less polluting products can be a win-win for profits and the environment. And this is an example. We've been talking about polystyrene today. Unfortunately, in the last legislative session, our banning polystyrene was not effective. It didn't pass. We've been trying to do that for a long time in fast food usage. I mean, there are many reasons to ban polystyrene in fast food uses, because it does escape into the environment. It's ubiquitous on our beaches, and also it's a human health hazard to eat from styrene, because it's a neurotoxin and a animal carcinogen and a probable human carcinogen. So when you put hot things in styrene, it leaches some incredible percentage. I think 92% of us, or maybe it's 98% of us, have styrene in our blood. So it does migrate. That's a fact. Anyway, when you start to ban polystyrene, as it's happening in many communities, we haven't got a statewide law yet, but California will be the place where it first passes. When you start to have all these local jurisdictions passing styrofoam bans, it triggers innovation. So this is a company, Ecovative, that took that challenge and started using mushrooms, fungi, to create sustainable packaging. IKEA uses this. That is mushroom. So not plastic. Another thing that can happen is cost savings. There's a miraculous story that I wrote about, a major win-win, where the largest school district association, the Urban School Food Alliance, which is a coalition of the largest school districts in the United States, that includes New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami-Dade, Dallas, and Orlando, they decided they wanted to get rid of the styrene lunch tray for student lunches. I mean, literally, we stopped using reusable lunch trays in schools a long time ago. They've gone from having people wash them to just using throwaway styrene trays. So we were poisoning our kids every lunch. So to get rid of the argument against switching to a renewable resource, a sustainable model, was cost. Well, styrofoam is so cheap, we can't afford to do the alternative. But what this school district alliance did was they used their aggregate buying power, and they found a manufacturer, actually Chinette, which is American-made, has an off-brand division that makes things that aren't marketed as Chinette. And they were using newspapers as feedstock to make these totally recycled trays out of paper. And because of the aggregate buying power, the cost came down to the same 0.44 cents for using something that's not poisonous, that's food grade, and is totally recycled, and is not something that's gonna ruin the environment after it's used. Can actually go into compost. So that's pretty exciting. So the final reason, one other reason is that California is an example of why businesses should support legislation. California, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. If we were a country, we would tie with the UK for our economic strength. And guess what California does more than any other state in this union? We regulate. We are the most regulated for the environment, public health, business safety, OSHA, all those things. And guess what? When California does the exact opposite of what Trump is preaching by saying regulations, get rid of them, hit 2 down for everyone you have, guess what? We thrive. The red states that are nixing all the environmental regulations, they are suffering. They're the poorest states. California is actually 1/7 of the entire gross national product of our nation. And we're doing it the right way. Actually, regulations overall save money because we're protecting our resources. We're not following the Onceler method. We're listening to the Lorax, and we are shining. So the final thing that I'd like to say is that businesses should support environmental regulation because unless. The final page of the Lorax story is when this little boy has listened to the Lorax's tale of horrible one-directional business practices. You know, what's a kid gonna think? It's all over. But the Lorax says, he drops down a truffle tree seed and he says, unless. That's the end of the book, unless. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, it's not gonna get better, it's not. And right now, it's business. It's business that should be accepting that truffle seed. It's business that has the power to save us because our government is entirely broken right now. There is no effective EPA. We've pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So businesses are actually thinking sustainably and coming to the rescue. There are people like Larry Fink saying, we have to do this. It's not okay just to care about short-term profits. There are businesses that are realizing that their profits can be hand in hand with efficient, sustainable business practices. And California is showing the way. So I just challenge all of you here in business to listen to the Lorax, to have a sustainable business, and to talk about it, to show the world that it works, it's environmental sustainable, and thank you for being in California and showing the rest of the country and the world that business and the environment go hand in hand.